Why does France have military bases in Africa? Yeah, we're talking about a former colonial power who's actually supposedly left the country since the 60s, but regardless of that departure, still has a military presence in Africa. What might be the reason for such a presence? And today in 2024, what's the current, analysis? Do we still have, a strong French military presence on the continent, or do we no longer have any French soldiers present, on the African continent? Well, this is the current, and this is the topic I will be discussing, and I will try to, as always, highlight the economic impact of such an external presence and such a foreign presence, on a continent where normally there should have never been, a French soldier from the beginning. Well, welcome to your favorite podcast, Smart, Intellectual, Knowledgeable African Talks. My name is S.I.K.A, and it's a pleasure, to be with you today. If you're not a part of our community of young African intellectuals and people who have a strong passion for development talks, well, all you have to do is just to click on the subscribe button, to activate the ring bell so that you don't miss out on any of the interesting episodes that I release weekly. And another recommendation is, please do not forget to click on the like button if you enjoy this episode or any of the existing episodes on the platform. It helps, the channel grow, and it helps a specific episode, to be actually, shown to other people so that, we can also share the most powerful perspective with the broader audience. So I will definitely appreciate that kind of support and interest. And lastly, you can also drop your comment if you feel like you want to make a contribution, or if you want to make a suggestion, or anything like that. Well, let's dive in. I mean, a couple of years ago, or a couple of decades ago, let's say in the 90s or even in the beginning of 2000, it would have probably been surrealistic, to ever ask that kind of question. Why does France have a military presence in Africa? And particularly in Francophone Africa. This is very important because what I'm discussing here is not a possible military presence, in Anglophone Africa, which is not the case actually. But we need to understand why is there a presence in Francophone Africa. And like I'm saying, 20 years ago, this question would have never, ever, been asked, I mean, few people might have tried, and they might have been actually, labeled as very rebellious, or, perhaps targeted or labeled, as some anarchist, because the norm, back then was to actually have, a French military presence, on African soil, especially in West and Central Francophone Africa. So why was that so normal? Well, we need to understand that the reason why a country, a developed economy like France, after over 50 years of independence, will still insist to be present, on African soil, especially in Francophone Africa, especially, in former French colonies, is again purely strategic. This is a strategic move, and this is where it gets very interesting. This channel is all about economic Pan-Africanisms, remember. And regardless of the topic, I always try to draw a link with economic development and the impact, a specific topic will have. Well, this is no different when it comes to this episode. So the military presence, happens because, first of all, it has to do with a strategic move. And the strategic move is only strategic because it's here to protect French interest in Africa. This is the first element we need to understand. Why does, after 50 years of independence, over 50 years of independence, France do insist, on having a military presence in Francophone Africa? Well, it's because primarily of all the economic interest and all the economic, stronghold, the Francophone Africa represent, to the French economy. Let me give you an example. You take companies like Bouygues, like Bolloré, like Colas, and you can name many other French private companies that are actually operating in Africa. But some of the most important are actually Bolloré and Bouygues. And these two companies have quite a sheer number of public agreement with former French colonies. They have agreement in almost every sector, in maritime sector, in logistic, in the food sector, you name it. They are present everywhere. So their presence, is very important to the French economy because we're talking about private company with a heavy presence in Africa, but they also represent a heavy source of income for France because they do pay tax. They do pay taxes back in France, and they also do pay, a very insignificant percentage of tax in Africa, where they're actually deriving 99% of their profit. So you will understand that it's very strategic for the main country, which is France, to, first of all, protect its interest, by protecting its private sector and its business, people who are actually, traveling and doing business outside the France border. But it's also very important and very strategic for France to also protect Francophone Africa because we're talking about a market. And remember, after the independence, as time went by, new generation were born and raised. And the problem with new generation is that you never know what kind of mindset they're going to have, especially if you have a generation in which many people do go and study abroad. It is not the same context as prior to the independence, where most of the brains and most of the talent, the domestic talent, were all shipped away to France to study and to get brainwashed. And that's very important because if you're all going to study to the same country, chances are you might have the same thought structure. You might also be influenced by the same power and the same energy. Of course, some of you, in the group are going to develop their own ways of thinking, their own ways of analysis, their original approach when it comes to development issues, when it comes to economic issues and health issues and stuff like that. But overall, having the same generation, like going and studying within the same environment reduces considerably the chances of friction, the chances of opposition, the chances of rebellion, and I'm putting rebellion in quotation here against the main country, which is actually France. So prior to the independence, the chances were very thin because it's not like you would have a quite a significant number of Ivorian back then, like going to study to America, going to study in China or in South Africa or in the UK or in Canada, you can name it. But like 99%, of graduates, were all shipped away to France. So when they return, they still have almost the same thought process and the same approach when it comes to analyzing issues and finding solutions. So it became almost natural for that generation to actually do business with France. But after the independence, we noticed a good and a very important change, especially in the 90s. Many people choose to actually like go and study outside France, or many people after getting the license or the master decided to actually do the PhD, in America or in English speaking country. So now you evolving within a new context, within a new environment. You now have a category of intellectuals strongly influenced by the French culture, and you have another category of intellectuals strongly influenced by the English culture. And then there is also a third category of people both influenced by the English and the French culture. So this entire mix, creates again another very difficult variable for France, which is the new generation from the 19s up to now. And I'm talking about people of my age, people in their 30s, people in the 20s, people in the 40s. Most of those people got exposed to a different ways of thinking, different ways of doing business. They got exposed with, like entrepreneurs from China, entrepreneurs from India. They got exposed to successful businessmen from United States of America, from Canada, from Emirate Arab, from Dubai, from Qatar. They got exposed to like a multicultural environment. So now this generation would like to be able to do business the way they see fit for the country. So in that particular, context, you will agree that the French military presence in Africa becomes threatened because originally the reason why the French soldiers, were actually sent in Francophone Africa was essentially to protect the economic interests of France in Africa. And that economic interest was very important. It was significant. It represented, almost like over 50%, of all international transactions in Francophone Africa from 1960 to 1990. This is just for you to understand how heavy, the French, interest, was in Francophone Africa, before the independence and slightly after the independence from 1960 to 1990. And after 1990, like I said, because of all this generational change and this generational, clash, the French domination, started to melt down. And now we notice, newcomers into the Francophone African market. We notice, the presence of Americans. We notice the presence of Chinese, Indian, Turkish people, Russian, like Francophone Africa no longer represent a barrier because the key barrier was the language component. But remember, because of having a mix of, generations and a mix of influence, a mix of intellectuals, with the background not just from France, but having their academic background from the US, from Canada, from Russia, from China, from India, from Malaysia, those people, when they're coming back, they now have a new skills, which is the foreign language. So remember, if you can speak, if you can address somebody in their language, you've already met them halfway. You can now, think of doing business with them. So this is, like the key reason I want you to keep in mind. I want you to understand that the key reason why we still have, and the key reason why there was and there is still a presence, of French soldiers in Francophone Africa is primarily because of all the economic, interests at stake. That's the first element. The second element to also consider is because of the importance of French business, to French economy in terms of tax paying. Because you also need to understand that one of the most important sources of revenue for a country, for a state, or for a nation is the fiscal system, the tax system. Taxes are very important to any country in the world. You take the United States of America, taxes are very important. It's detrimental. It's critical. It's vital to the American economy. If you're removing the contribution of tax, to the national source of revenue, you will actually deplete the American economy from a very, very sizable amount of money. The same happened to France. The same happened for Canada. The same happened for Côte d'Ivoire, for Mali, for Burkina Faso. It's very important, the tax system. So this is another reason why there is such a strong military presence, because they aware of the importance of the Francophone market, the Francophone African market, but they're also aware of the importance of their business and the private sector operating in Africa. And the third reason, which is also not the least, but it's very important, is because they wanted to also make sure that whoever was in power back then will no longer, touch on their economic interest. So to be very simple, the French soldiers in Francophone Africa were present to also make sure that, Francophone African government, were also making sure to implement, to adopt, and to enact, the adequate laws to making sure that while they are developing their domestic market, they are not also touching on the interest of France. Let me know what you think of this episode and this analysis. This is the first part of this very interesting topic. I want you to understand why it's very important to, look at the presence of the French soldiers in Africa, and let me know what other perspectives you can also share, when it comes to this very interesting topic. Thank you for listening to your favorite podcast, S.I.K.A. Talks, the only podcast where strong realities meet powerful perspectives. À bientôt.